at UC Riverside. Just a really super talented person and a great old friend. Give it up for Mr. Stu Krieger. Yay. The crowd loves you if you heard that applause.
Happy to know that.
Thanks so much for being here. I look back. One of the things I think we can both say now is like, wow, we've had long careers and different careers. And I want to get to all of that with you. But first off, go back because I talked about how I got started. How did you get started? I know some of it involves the Herald Examiner, which I want to talk about later. But just tell us generally, you're from Rochester and somehow you end up in Hollywood with a great career.
Yeah. And one of the things I always say, especially since I've become an educator, is that I was a bit of a weirdo and that I, as you mentioned, grew up in Rochester, New York, and really, really early on said to my family, I belong in Hollywood. I should be. First, I thought I was going to be an actor because, as you remember, I had big flaming red hair. And
you looked like the guy on Room 222.
Exactly. So I used to take pictures out of the family album and send them literally in an envelope that said Walt Disney, Hollywood, California. And I would write on the back, look, I'm an adorable redhead. You should put me in a movie, preferably with Hayley Mills.
That's funny because we want to talk about that too. I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah. And oddly enough, Walt never wrote back. But we did a family vacation here when I was 12. And at the end of 2 weeks in Los Angeles, I said, I'm just telling you people, as soon as I'm old enough to do what I want to do, this is where I belong.
Right. And I should mention, let me say this, is that Stu has two brothers who couldn't be more different from him. One is like a total jock who got into the sports business and has a son playing pro baseball. The other one lives off the land. All I know is he lives in a house in Rochester without a furnace.
Like they actually finally have moved into a house that does, but you are right. The entire time they were raising their children. Absolutely 100% true.
Yeah, it's like Little House on the Prairie, but in Rochester, they're burning wood to stay warm. And so that is not, suffice it to say, that is not you.
Right. So that was, and I was the middle kid. Yeah. And, I have always said, we could get to that when we get to the Hayley part of it, that having a crush on Hayley Mills when I was a kid was the confirmation of my heterosexuality, because being the middle of two jocks, it was always like, you're gay, you write, you draw, you do this, you do that. And it was like, well, I don't think so, because I look at Hayley and get really excited in a way that's probably not, but I'm good. So anyway.
Did you ever tell her that? We'll get to Hayley Mills.
I did. I actually did.
Oh, boy. That's right.
Yeah. So anyway, made good on my promise, graduated college back east, and immediately worked the summer to earn enough money to move across country, and came here when I was 21.
Right.
So this Halloween, I will celebrate my 50th anniversary in Los Angeles.
Unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I'm in the 40 years, and it's just crazy when you think about it. It went quickly, but now it's sort of like, oh my God, that's literally a lifetime that we've been doing this. It's so what was your first job? Like when you came out, did you just get a job?
No, as you mentioned, I arrived, I always say it, there wasn't like an uncle at the studio, look up this guy or that guy. There was nothing. So I just blanketed the town with anything I could possibly even think remotely tangentially related. So I applied to be a page at NBC, a tour guide at Universal, a critter at Disneyland, radio stations, TV stations. And the first hit I got was from the Herald Examiner. And it was in its dying days. So anybody that was a real journalist worked at the LA Times.
I love the Herald Examiner, though. I love that paper.
Nice.
Because it was the underdog. But it was just, there was something about it. And I think Lou Grant was on at the time. And it just sort of reeked of the underdog. So I liked it.
Yeah. And it really, literally, when I was there, it was only kids my age and old rummies that were on Hearst contracts that were lifetime. And there was nobody in between. And that was who the people were. And my favorite day as a copy boy was I went to, each time a new edition would roll off the presses, we had to get it and bring it into the city editors to look over before the next edition. And it was the day Onassis died. And I go and grab it off the press line. And the headline was Shipping Magnet, Magnet, Onassis dies. And I went up to the desk and I said, hey, you guys, I don't think this is the word you meant.
Yeah. Put it out anyway, kid. Shut up, kid.
Yeah. So it was kind of like that.
Was James Bacon still there when you were there?
100%.
Oh man, that's old Hollywood there. That is old school.
Yeah, and that was part of the next jump start to my career was I was hired as a copy boy, but I would hang around the entertainment department as much as I possibly could, just asking them questions, bugging them. And finally, they started letting me go out and do movie reviews and movie star
Really?
interviews. And every time that I did that, I got to interview Sally Struthers when she was on All in the Family, Suzanne Plachette when she was on the Newhart Show.
Yeah.
And at the end of every interview, I would say, hey, do you have 10 minutes? Because what I really want to do is, and most people were incredibly generous with their time, and kind of pretty quickly the message I got was you can't do anything till you get an agent. That's where your energy should be. Start sending scripts out, start trying to find somebody to represent you, because most places won't read from unsolicited material. So
Right. And so what were you writing at the time? Were you writing screenplays?
yeah.
But they weren't kid oriented. They were not kids.
No, it's funny because the first 2 or 3 things that I did that actually got picked up and made were all who I was. I was 20 at the Herald, 23, 24 years old, and I was writing these earnest coming of age, trying to find myself.
Right.
Those kinds of young people entering the world stories.
Right. And so you eventually found an agent who I think you were with for a long time, right?
No, my very, very first agent, you're talking about Dan Ostroff, who we'll get to in a moment. But my very first agent was just one. At the time, the Writers Guild put out a list of agencies, and then there was a subheading of these people will read from unproduced writers. And it was an agency on Sunset Boulevard. It was 2 people. They were actually romantic partners, 2 guys. And my favorite thing was one of their 95-year-old mothers was the receptionist. So it was the 2 of them and their 100-year-old.
That's a show right there.
Yeah, it was the Dale Garrick Agency. And you would call and she would say, Garrick Agency. And I would say, hi, it's Stu Krieger. No, Stu's not here. And I would say, no, I'm Stu. I'm calling, and it was it was a sitcom every time you tried to call the office.
And so did they get some stuff out for you and got something? Was something sold through them?
Yeah. So the first thing that happened was they had a spec script and they were sending it out, and it was a low budget producer looking for somebody to write a teen coming of age movie for him, and that was Mike McFarland, and that ended up being my very first movie, Goodbye Franklin High, which he also produced Satan's Cheerleaders, which is where Hillary and I met.
Oh my God, I did not know that, or I did and forgot it.
Yeah.
And that's where you met your wife, Hillary. That's so funny.
Yep.
Satan's Cheerleaders, and which I know you have that poster somewhere in your house. I can't remember where, but I
not only do we have that, I have the original crew T-shirt with the logo on it still.
Satan's Cheerleaders. It's just one of those movies like I've seen in a drive-in. I don't know. Back when they made movies like that.
Well, and the worst part about, movies never die is now that I've been a professor, every couple of years, somebody will come in and go, dude, look what I found. And they've got both Satan's Cheerleaders and Goodbye Franklin High on their laptop or their iPad showing me yeah, I know.
But the thing, Goodbye Franklin High, you could say oh, it's it's what it is. But Satan's Cheerleaders tells you right off the bat what it is. There's no inference there. It's Satan's Cheerleaders.
Hillary has always described it as a porno movie with no sex.
Then what's the point? So we are, gosh, I knew this was going to happen. There's so much to talk about, but that's good. So I do want to talk about, we'll open up and we'll pick it up on the other side of this break too, is Land Before Time, because you had a bunch of successes. I mean, you wrote a Pauly Shore movie that got made. That was a big, now he's sort of a judge like Pauly Shore. But at the time, that was a huge deal. You're in the Army now, and your buddy directed it, right? Dan Petrie?
Yep.
And then you stumble into Land Before Time, which, if there's one thing, I think that's safe to say, the thing most connected to your movie career. Would that be safe?
Absolutely.
And so how did that happen? And how did you get to write for kids all of a sudden?
2 parts to that question, which is, first of all, one of the things that I think is a really, really wonderful piece of advice to anybody who wants to do this for a living is everything we're about to talk about happened because the first couple of movies, as I mentioned, that I did were all young adult coming of age, and writers get typecast as quickly as actors do. And so those were the kinds of jobs I was going out for. And I had this like, no, I am actually more than that. And I want to be more than that. So I took 3 months off. I wrote a script called Kinfolk, which was the most autobiographical thing I ever wrote. And it ended up
and got you a lot of work.
Yes. So the thing about that was so pivotal was it was at a time, now there's the blacklist, and the equivalent at the time was American Film Magazine did the 10 best unproduced scripts in Hollywood, and Kinfolk ended up on that list.
This is coming back to me now.
Yeah. So Josh Brand and John Falsey read that script. They had been hired to be the producers of Amazing Stories, Spielberg's foray into television.
Right.
And based on that script, they hired me to write an episode of Amazing Stories. And when Steven read that, well, he also had read Kinfolk, but then when he read the episode of Amazing Stories, he gave me 3 more to write and then brought me on as part of the second season story editing panel for Amazing Stories. And then that led to Land Before Time.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're caught up there. We're going to take our first break. I'm talking to Stu Krieger. He's a writer, producer, educator, now a novelist. You can follow him at Stu Krieger on Instagram, but he's got 2 books out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. His new one is called The Raft. His previous one is called The One Cigarette, which I really, really love because it's around the time of the JFK assassination, and I love that stuff. I can't help it. Anyway, we're talking to him. We're going to take our break now. You're listening to It's Radio with TV's Tim Stack. We'll be right